5 years. 5 years of hunting across every border, every ruin, every blood-soaked frontier of this empire. And Alpha King Draven Blackthorn still couldn't find her. The bond didn't care that he was king. It pulled at him like a hook buried beneath his ribs, twisting deeper. Every night he slept alone. Every morning he woke with her scent on the edge of his breath and nothing in his arms. A king who owned the world couldn't find one woman. If that doesn't break something in your chest, stay with me, because what he found at the end of this search will ruin you completely. Drop your city in the comments. Hit that like button. This one's going to hurt. The war room smelled like old candle wax and cold ambition. Draven stood at the head of the strategy table, both hands pressed flat against the carved map of the Ashenvale Empire, and stared at 5 years of failure rendered in red ink. Every marked settlement, every dispatch tracker team, every seer who had taken his coin and returned with nothing but apologies and half-formed visions that dissolved before he could grip them. The red marks covered the map like wounds that refused to close. Outside, the morning bells struck 6. Blackthorn Keep groaned around him, stone and timber settling in the cold, the way old fortresses did, like they were breathing in their sleep. 23,000 people lived within his walls and the surrounding city. His generals slept 3 floors up. His household guard rotated in the courtyard below. His kingdom stretched from the Ashenvale lowlands to the frost-scarred mountain passes of the northern reach, and every inch of it answered to his name. None of it helped him sleep. He hadn't slept properly in 4 years, 11 months, and some number of days he'd stopped counting because counting made it worse. Your Majesty. Commander Aldrich Voss stepped through the war room door without knocking. He was one of the few men alive who could do that without Draven removing a hand for it. Short, thick-necked, with a scar that bisected his left eyebrow and gave his face a permanent expression of skeptical exhaustion, Aldrich had served 3 kings and considered ceremony a waste of time best spent on actual work. He stopped beside Draven and looked at the map. "They're back," Aldrich said. "I can tell from your voice that they brought nothing." "They brought a theory." Draven straightened. He rolled his shoulders back, the joints cracking with the sound of a man who'd been standing over a table for 3 hours in the pre-dawn cold. "I have 47 theories on that map. What I don't have is a location." Captain Morrow says the bond tray shifted again. Aldrich set a folded report on the table and didn't move to open it. "Same direction as last month, northwest pull, toward the keep." The silence that followed had weight. Draven turned his head and looked at his commander without expression. "Toward the keep. That's what Morrow says. That's what he said last month. He's saying it with more confidence this time. Says the pull is closer, stronger." Aldrich finally reached out and flipped the report open. The handwriting was dense and deliberate. Morrow wrote like a man who expected his words to be read by someone looking for a reason to disagree. He wants to do a formal trace within the castle walls. Full team. The interior chambers, the lower levels, No. The word landed flat and final. Aldrich didn't flinch. He'd heard that particular tone before. He knew better than to treat it as the end of the conversation. "Draven." "I said no." Draven picked up the report, scanned it, and set it back down. His jaw was tight. "Running a bond trace through my own castle, through my own halls, with my entire court watching." He shook his head once. "I have spent 5 years maintaining the image of a king who has this situation managed. The moment my trackers start walking my banquet halls with detection stones, I become something else. You become a man who's looking in the right place. I become a man who's been searching his own house for 5 years without finding what's there." Draven's voice didn't rise. It never rose. That was the particular quality of his authority that his enemies always underestimated. The absolute stillness of it, the way it pressed instead of struck. "That is not a narrative I'm willing to hand to the noble houses. Not with the spring assemblies coming. Not with Harlan and Castle already circling the question of succession." Aldrich was quiet for a moment. "The bond's killing you," he said. "The bond is inconvenient. You haven't eaten a full meal in 3 days. You sleep 2 hours and wake screaming. Don't look at me like that," the night guard reports to me, "not just to you. You're running command on willpower and spite, and that's impressive, but it has a ceiling. Aldrich crossed his arms. If the trace point's inside these walls, then your mate is inside these walls. That's not a political problem. That's a fact you deal with. Draven walked to the narrow window and looked out at the courtyard below. The morning guard change was happening. Soldiers rotating at the iron gate, their breath steaming in the early cold, armor catching the thin light. His empire, moving without him needing to touch it. He'd built it that way deliberately. A kingdom that ran on his attention alone was a kingdom one bad season away from collapse. He'd thought about her, in the abstract way he allowed himself, only late at night, and only when exhaustion stripped away his defenses. What she might look like, what her voice might sound like, whether she was frightened or furious or somewhere in between, whether she knew about him at all, whether the bond spoke to her the way it spoke to him, that low, insistent pull under his sternum that never went quiet, that he'd learned to move through the way a man learns to move through chronic pain, not by stopping it, but by absorbing it so completely it became part of his gait. 5 years of that. He was 31 years old, and he felt ancient. Authorize Morrow's trace, Draven said. Keep it contained. Inner corridors only, lower staff levels. Frame it as a routine security sweep. We've had those before. No one will question it if it's done with the right personnel. No detection stones in the main hall or the upper residential wings. And it happens at night when the court is sleeping. Aldrich said nothing for a moment. Then, I'll have it set up by tonight. Good. Draven kept his eyes on the courtyard. And Aldrich, if Morrow's wrong again, he's not wrong this time. The commander moved toward the door. I don't know how I know that. I just know. He left. The door closed, and Draven Blackthorn stood alone in the war room with his hands behind his back and stared at the courtyard and felt the pull beneath his ribs tighten like something was trying to drag him through the floor. The noble delegation arrived at the third hour of morning, which was technically an insult dressed as a courtesy visit. Lord Edric Castle swept into the upper reception hall with 9 attendants, 2 legal scribes, and the specific energy of a man who believed his timing was socially acceptable because he was rich enough to make it so. He was 60, wide through the chest, silver-haired, and had spent 30 years being the second most powerful man in the Ashenvale Empire in ways that never quite showed up in the formal hierarchy. His family had financed 2 of Draven's border campaigns. He considered that a form of ownership. Draven received him standing, which was deliberate. A seated king invited negotiation. A standing king communicated that this meeting had already been decided. Lord Castle. No warmth, no ceremony. You're early. I'm punctual, Castle said, with the smile of a man who'd never once in his life believed that distinction mattered. And I bring a matter too significant to wait for proper scheduling. Everything you've ever brought me has been too significant to wait. And I've always been right. Castle gestured for his scribes to set up at the side table. They moved with trained efficiency, unrolling documents, arranging ink, settling into their chairs with the rehearsed smoothness of men who'd done this in many rooms before. The spring assembly is in 3 weeks, Your Majesty. The succession question will be raised formally for the 4th consecutive year. I'd like to arrive with an answer. The succession question, Draven said, is not a question. I am 31 years old, and I rule the largest empire in the known world. The succession is managed. The succession requires an heir. But Castle moved to the side table and picked up one of the documents. Not reading it, just holding it, a gesture of controlled power. Which requires a mate, which you have been, he paused, choosing his word with surgical precision, pursuing for some years now without result. I'm aware of my own search's timeline, Castle. Then you understand the concern. The Lord set the document down and met Draven's eyes with the particular directness of a man who'd calculated exactly how much he could say and had decided that amount was a great deal. The assembly houses have been patient. The empire has been patient. But patience is not indefinite, and there are questions being asked that I, personally, have been doing my best to manage. About stability. About lineage. About what happens to this empire if the king dies without an heir. I'm not planning to die. Kings never plan to die. They simply do. Casil spread his hands. Lord Harlan and I have discussed a proposal. A formal arrangement. A noble match. A consolidation of the eastern and southern houses that would... No. Draven. The title dropped. It wasn't disrespect, or not only disrespect. It was an attempt at intimacy, at the kind of frank conversation that men of equal power had behind closed doors when the formality became a waste of everyone's time. I have known you since before you took the throne. Your father trusted my counsel. I am not your enemy. You're an advisor with interests, Draven said. That's not the same as an ally, and it's not the same as an enemy. It's a third thing that requires watching. Casil's expression shifted, something tightening behind his eyes that he controlled well but not well enough. The bond can be circumvented. It's been done before in Get Out. The two words came out of Draven's chest like stones dropped into still water, and the room stopped. Your Majesty. I said get out! Draven turned to face Casil directly and the older man. For all his confidence, for all his wealth and influence and 30 years of political survival, took a half step back before he caught himself. You do not come to me before sunrise and recommend that I circumvent my mate bond. You do not bring legal scribes to write up the framework for how I should replace what I haven't yet found. And you do not, he said very quietly, speak to me as though this is a negotiation. Casil held his ground for 3 seconds. Then he straightened, adjusted his coat, and turned to his attendants. We'll continue this conversation at the assembly. We will not. The delegation left. The scribes rolled up their documents with the hasty, careful movements of people who'd heard too much and were now primarily interested in getting out of the room without becoming relevant to whatever came next. Draven waited until the door closed. Then he pressed 2 fingers against the inside of his wrist, against the pulse point, and breathed slowly. The pull beneath his sternum had sharpened during the confrontation. It always did when he was under pressure, when his body's systems were running hot, when whatever biology governed the mate bond decided to remind him that it existed and had opinions. He hated that. He hated that his own body functioned as a second opinion on everything he did. He hated, if he was honest, that Casil wasn't entirely wrong. 5 years was a long time. His body knew it. The bond knew it. And somewhere in the depths of his keep, or so Morrow now claimed, the woman on the other end of the bond knew it too. He just had to find her first. Captain Morrow was 26, lean and angular, with tracker's eyes, the kind that had learned to see movement in peripheral space and couldn't fully switch off even in conversation. He developed his gift young, trained under 3 senior trackers before the previous King's Court had dissolved, and had come to Draven's service with a record that made him useful in ways that Draven had needed. He gave his briefing in the lower command chamber, with 2 of his senior team members present and a detection array spread across the central table. The stones were flat and dark gray, each the size of a palm, carved with faint channeling lines. They didn't glow. They vibrated, at a frequency just below what normal senses could register, and Morrow had described the sensation once as like trying to hear music through 3 walls. The trace has been consistent for 6 weeks, Morrow said, not preambling, which Draven appreciated. Direction held steady, intensity increasing. That tells us 2 things. The source isn't moving, and the source is alive. He moved his hand over the array without touching it. Bond traces weaken when the other person is sick or under severe stress. Intensity increasing means she's... He paused. It means she's maintaining. Location, Draven said. Morrow looked up. His jaw moved once before he answered. That's what I want to run the castle sweep to confirm. But my best estimate, based on the directionality... He pressed his palm to the side of the array, and all 3 stones shifted orientation, the carved lines rotating like compass needles. They pointed northwest, down, toward the lower levels of the keep, toward the foundations. Draven was still for a long moment. How far down? He said. My estimate is 3 levels below current garrison depth. Morrow held his voice even with visible effort. Possibly 4. 3 to 4 levels below garrison depth was not the servants' quarters. It was not the storage vaults or the water management tunnels or any of the functional infrastructure of the keep. 3 to 4 levels below garrison depth was where the cells were, the deep ones. The ones that didn't have windows. Draven's face didn't change. That was training. That was 23 years of learning how to receive catastrophic information in front of other people without handing them a weapon. Run the sweep, he said, but tonight. Same parameters as authorized this morning. Morrow nodded. His expression was careful in the way of a man who understood that he was standing at the edge of something much larger than a tracking exercise and had chosen, wisely, to limit himself to his professional function. We'll have confirmation by midnight, he said. Well, by midday, two things had happened that Draven hadn't planned for. The first was the arrival of Lord Harlan's second son, Peter, who appeared at the south gate with a retinue of 18 soldiers and a formal request for an emergency audience. Peter Harlan was 24, visibly nervous behind an affect of casual importance, and had the look of a man executing instructions he hadn't written himself. The audience lasted 11 minutes. Peter said nothing. His father hadn't already communicated through Cassell's morning visit, only with less skill and more visible anxiety. Draven sent him back with a formal acknowledgement and no substantive reply. The second was more concerning. His head of household, a woman named Bren Vault, who had managed Blackthorn Keep's domestic operations for 16 years and communicated only in clipped practical sentences, appeared at his study door at the second afternoon hour with a ledger and an expression that Draven had learned, over time, to read as the precursor to information he didn't want. The lower supply rotation, she said, setting the ledger on his desk. There's a discrepancy. Draven pulled the ledger toward him. The columns were neat, organized by month. The discrepancy wasn't subtle once you saw it. A consistent quantity of food and water being requisitioned from stores and routed to a section of the keep listed in the ledger as Lower Infrastructure Maintenance Level 7. He didn't keep a maintenance crew on Level 7. He'd checked that 3 years ago, after a guard reported hearing sounds from the deep levels that turned out to be a water seal failure. Level 7 had been surveyed, the seal repaired, and the section cleared. How long has this been happening, he said. At least 3 years. Possibly longer. The older ledgers are in the archive, and I'd need time to cross-reference. Bren's voice didn't change. I noticed it in the current quarter because I was reconciling the winter stores and the numbers didn't sit right. Who authorized the requisitions? They go through a senior staff seal. I believe... Bren paused, which for her was equivalent to a long hesitation. I believe the seal is Lord Vane's. Lord Harlan Vane, senior noble of the Eastern Houses, Castle's oldest ally in the Assembly. A man who had sat in Draven's court for 12 years, attended his war councils, and signed off on 3 major imperial edicts. Leave the ledger, Draven said. Don't discuss this with anyone. Bren left. Draven sat very still and looked at the numbers. 3 years of food and water requisitions to a section of the keep that wasn't supposed to have anyone in it. The bond pull under his sternum was so strong now, it was almost physical pain, like something trying to climb up through the foundations. He authorized the sweep to begin 2 hours early. Morrow took 4 trackers and moved through the keep's lower levels with the systematic precision of people who'd done this professionally for years. No detection stones in public areas, no visible equipment. They looked, in the dim utility corridors of the deep keep, like maintenance workers doing rounds. Draven followed them himself, which he'd told Aldrich he wasn't going to do. Aldrich came anyway, which was not a surprise. Level 3, the garrison subfloor. Nothing. Level 4, old storage and decommissioned quarters. The stones registered a faint directional signal. Morrow marked it and pushed further down. Level 5. The signal strengthened. One of the younger trackers, a woman named Sarah, stopped walking and went still, pressing the back of her hand against the wall with the instinctual gestures of someone reading through her skin rather than her eyes. Alive, she said quietly. Definitely alive, and she frowned. Scared. Not of us, Morrow said. He was watching his stone. She doesn't know we're here. Draven said nothing. Level 6, the pull in his chest was almost unbearable. He'd never felt it at this intensity. It had always been a background pressure, something he'd learned to metabolize, to function through. Now it was loud. Now it was directional. Now it was pointing him forward through the dark corridor like an arrow lodged in his ribs. Level 7. The corridor here was narrow and cold. The ceiling was lower than the upper levels, the stone older, cut with the rougher tools of an earlier era of construction. Torches burned in iron brackets every 30 feet, kept lit by the same rotation that was provisioning food. Someone had been maintaining this level. Someone had been keeping it livable. Morrow stopped at the third door on the right. The detection stones all oriented to it simultaneously, the carved lines pointing at the wood like they were trying to press through it. "Here," Morrow said. Draven looked at the door. It was heavy, iron-reinforced, with a lock plate that had been recently oiled. No rust on the mechanism, the hinges clean. A small opening at eye level, currently closed. The kind of door that kept people in, not out. He reached out and slid the eye-level panel open. Inside was a small cell, lit by a single oil lamp that hung from a chain in the ceiling. A low bed against one wall, neatly made with what looked like rough-spun blankets. A small table, a bucket of water, a wooden cup beside it. A pile of cloth in one corner that might be spare clothing, and a woman sitting on the edge of the bed. She was looking at the door. She'd heard them. She was younger than he'd somehow expected, though he hadn't consciously formed an expectation. Mid-20s, perhaps, thin in the way that was not natural for her frame, the kind of thinness that spoke of lean rations stretched over years, of a body that had learned to function on less. Her hair was dark and had been recently braided, tight against her head, the practical braid of someone who'd learned to manage their appearance with minimal resources. There was a silver mark visible on her left wrist, against the inside, catching the lamplight. She'd pulled her sleeve down, but not fast enough. Her eyes, when they met the gap in the door, were dark and absolutely steady. She didn't flinch. She didn't call out. She looked at the opening in her door with the eyes of a person who had been looking at that door for a very long time and had stopped expecting anything behind it to be good. The bond hit Draven like a physical blow to the chest, not the distant pull he'd learned to live with, not the manageable ache. This was the full weight of a mate bond at close proximity, activated by mutual recognition. His body knowing before his mind caught up, every system locking onto her the way compass needle locks on north, the way fire orients itself to oxygen, the way something that has been starved for 5 years finally finds the thing it was starved for. He couldn't breathe. Behind him, Morrow had gone completely still. Sarah had taken a step back. Aldrich said nothing. On the other side of the door, the woman on the bed looked at the opening, and then her chin lifted and something crossed her face that wasn't hope, and wasn't fear, and wasn't relief. It was something harder than all three. Something tempered. "Who's there?" she said. Her voice was low and direct, and had absolutely nothing deferential in it. Draven pressed his hand flat against the door. "Open it," he said. The guard who'd followed them down fumbled for the key. The lock disengaged with a sound that seemed enormously loud in the narrow corridor. The hinges moved. The door swung inward. She was on her feet before it fully opened, not backing against the wall, standing at the center of the cell, facing the door, her weight balanced, her hands loose at her sides. The silver mark on her wrist was fully visible now. She wasn't trying to hide it, she was looking at him. Draven stepped through the door. She looked at him the way a person looks at someone they've been building a case against for a very long time. Not with hatred, not yet, or not only, but with the grim, measured weight of someone who has been putting their evidence in order for years and has just watched their primary witness walk through their door. "You're the king," she said. Not a question. She knew who he was. "Yes," he said. "How long?" she said. He didn't pretend not to understand the question. 5 years, he said. Something moved across her face. He watched it pass, pain, fury, and something underneath those that he didn't have language for yet, that he would need time and whatever time could provide to understand. "Then you should know," she said, and her voice was very steady, "that my name is Lyra Ashvale, and I was brought here in the 3rd year of your reign, and every document that authorized my imprisonment carries your seal." He said nothing. Because she was right. He knew she was right. He didn't remember her specifically. She'd been a case file, a brief counsel proceeding, a name on a formal order during a period when those orders were coming through in stacks, each one reviewed in minutes and signed because his advisors had told him the evidence was conclusive, and he had been, in those first years of his reign, still learning which advisors he could trust. He hadn't known yet that the ones who handed him documents with the most confidence were the ones who drafted those documents themselves. She was watching his face. She was reading him the way someone reads a man they've had 5 years to study from the outside, from the whispers of guards and the overheard conversations of staff who thought the deep cells were empty. "You didn't know," she said. It wasn't absolution. It was a statement of fact, delivered with the precision of a woman who has long since learned the difference between ignorance and innocence. "No," he said. "That," Lyra said, "is the second worst thing about this." "What's the first?" She looked at him for a long moment, and then she held up her left wrist and turned it toward him. The silver mark was clear and sharp in the lamplight, unmistakable to anyone who knew what they were seeing. "That I recognize the bond the same week they put me down here," she said. "And I have been waiting 5 years to find out if you were the kind of man who would come through that door or the kind of man who would send someone else." The silence stretched, and then from the corridor behind Draven came the sound of boots. Not Morrow's team, not Aldrich, not anyone who was supposed to be on this level. And a voice that didn't belong to any of his guards said, with the flat authority of an order being executed, not given, "Don't move." Draven turned. 4 armed men, house colors he recognized in the half-second before they moved, and behind them, stepping out of the shadows with the unhurried manner of a man who had been waiting in exactly this place for exactly this moment, Lord Harlan Vane. "I'm sorry, Your Majesty," Vane said, and he wasn't. "I can't let you leave this level with her." Draven didn't move. That was the first thing. The reflex that every man with a weapon and a threat in front of him had to suppress. The immediate reach, the immediate posture, the declaration of intent through body language that told the room what was about to happen. He suppressed it. He stood in the center of Lyra's cell with his hands at his sides, and he looked at Harlan Vane, and he breathed. 4 armed men. House colors. Vane's personal guard, not Imperial soldiers. That distinction mattered. Imperial soldiers answered to a chain of command that ran through Aldrich and ultimately back to Draven. Vane's personal guard answered only to Vane, and Vane had just made his position extremely clear. Aldrich was in the corridor, 3 feet behind Draven. Morrow and his team were further back. The numbers weren't catastrophic, but the corridor was narrow enough that it neutralized size advantages, and Vane's men were positioned with the deliberate spacing of people who'd rehearsed this. They'd known he was coming down here tonight. Someone on his team had talked. "Harlan!" Draven's voice came out even. Not controlled. Controlled implied effort. This was something else. The particular flatness that came from a man who had learned that the most dangerous thing he could communicate in a crisis was that he was surprised by it. "You've been feeding a prisoner in my dungeon for 3 years without authorization." "I've been protecting an asset," Vane said. He walked forward 2 steps, stopping just outside the cell doorway, which kept Draven's body between him and Lyra. That was deliberate, too. A situation that got complicated when your trackers started getting competent. An asset. "Don't look at me like that. You've done worse with less justification." Vane's voice was the voice of a man who had spent decades in rooms where power was negotiated and had developed, over time, the particular confidence of someone who believed he understood how those rooms worked better than anyone else in them. "She was a liability that needed to be managed. I managed her. She's alive, isn't she? I could have done otherwise." Behind Draven, Lyra said nothing. He didn't look back at her. He kept his eyes on Vane and processed the statement with the rapid, cold calculation that 5 years of ruling an empire had sharpened in him to an edge that he rarely had occasion to show in full. She was a liability that needed to be managed, which meant Vane had known who she was from the beginning, which meant the framing, the conspiracy charge, the rushed evidence, the brief proceeding that Draven had signed off on during a period of council-managed policy hadn't been circumstantial corruption or bureaucratic failure. It had been specific. It had been targeted. It had been aimed at the woman currently standing 4 feet behind him with 5 years of captivity in her body and absolute steadiness in her eyes. "You framed her," Draven said. I neutralized a threat. To who? Vane smiled. It was the smile of a man who had been waiting a long time to have this conversation in a context where he held the exit. To the natural order of succession planning, to the stability of the noble council, to the managed transition of power that this empire needs if it's going to survive the next generation. He tilted his head. You were a 26-year-old king who'd just taken a throne with too much blood on it and not enough experience to know what you didn't know. A fated mate bond was, he paused, an unpredictable variable. An unpredictable variable. A woman with a bond claim on the king is a woman with access, influence, political weight that doesn't go through proper channels. Vane spread his hands slightly, the gesture of a man explaining something reasonable to someone he's decided to treat as capable of reason. I didn't know who she was when I first identified the bond mark. I found out she existed through a contact in the Seer network, had her background investigated, determined she came from a minor house with no notable alliances, and concluded that the easiest solution was containment. Containment, Draven said. That's what you're calling it. I'm calling it what it was. I've been calling things what they are for 30 years, and it's why I'm still standing. The four guards hadn't moved. Their hands were on their weapons, but the weapons weren't drawn. Vane was still in control of his own scene, which meant he hadn't decided yet how this ended. That was the opening. A man who's decided how something ends doesn't position himself to negotiate. Vane was still here because he wanted something, or because he needed something, which was a different kind of vulnerability. What do you want? Draven said. I want what I've always wanted. Stability. A succession plan that doesn't hinge on a woman who spent 5 years in a cell and will spend the next 5 years being a political problem. Vane's eyes moved past Draven's shoulder, toward Lyra. She's not your queen, Draven. She's your damage, and I'm offering you a way to manage that damage cleanly. Draven said nothing. The bond doesn't have to define your reign, Vane continued. There are ways to... If you finish that sentence, Draven said, I will consider it a declaration of war against the throne. The corridor went very quiet. Vane held his gaze for 3 full seconds. Then something behind his eyes shifted. Not fear, not quite, but the recalibration of a man who had just heard a line he hadn't expected to be drawn here, in a basement, over a woman he'd been dismissing for years. You don't know what you're walking into, Vane said, and his voice had changed. Still controlled, but with something underneath it now. She's not the only threat I'm holding. The Assembly, the Eastern Compact, the border financing, those are all structures I've maintained. You pull me out and things fall. Then they fall, Draven said, and I rebuild them without the parts that were rotten. Lyra's voice came from behind him, quiet and direct. He's stalling. Draven felt it at the same moment she said it. The subtle shift in the guard's posture, the weight transfer that happened just before movement, the collective intake of breath. He moved, not toward Vane, sideways, into the guard on the left who was the closest and most committed, because the first man you take down in a confined space becomes an obstacle for everyone behind him. He got inside the weapon arm before it cleared the scabbard, drove the man's elbow up and back, and heard the crack that meant the shoulder joint had separated. The man went down with a sound that wasn't quite a scream. Aldrich was already moving in the corridor. Morrow's team converged from the back, and the narrow space did what narrow spaces always do. It equalized, and equalization favored the people who'd been fighting in corridors their whole professional lives over the people who usually fought in open council chambers. It was over in 40 seconds. Not clean, nothing in a dungeon corridor was clean, but decisive. Vane's guards were down or restrained. Vane himself had backed against the far wall of the corridor with the specific posture of a man who did not personally do violence and was now confronting the consequence of that choice. A cut on his cheekbone. From what he probably couldn't say, the chaos of a dungeon fight didn't announce its sources, was bleeding freely down his jaw. Aldrich held him by the collar. Draven straightened. His knuckles were split. He registered it distantly. The way you register minor damage when your body is still running on the chemistry of a fight. It would hurt later, which was fine. Later was something he could plan for. He turned around. Lyra was standing exactly where she'd been. She hadn't moved during the fight. She'd stayed centered in her cell, balanced, watching, and the expression on her face when he turned was not relief or gratitude. It was assessment. She was looking at him the way you look at something you've been theorizing about for 5 years, and are now seeing in person for the first time, trying to determine how closely reality matches the model. "You moved fast," she said. "I've had practice." "On who?" "People who needed moving." Her eyes went to his hands, the split knuckles, then back to his face. Something in her expression shifted, not softening exactly, more like the adjustment a person makes when the evidence changes and they're too honest with themselves to pretend it doesn't. "He'll have contingencies," she said. "Whatever Vane told you about the threads he's holding, that's not bluster. He's been managing pieces of this empire for longer than you've been running it." "I know. Then you know this isn't over." "It's not over," he agreed, "but the shape of it has changed." He stepped back into the corridor and crouched in front of Vane, who was still being held upright by Aldrich. Vane's expression had settled into the tight, compressed dignity of a man who had calculated that showing distress was more costly than showing nothing. "Here's what's going to happen," Draven said. "You're going to be held in the upper security wing, not the dungeon, because I'm not interested in the irony. Your household is going to be notified that you're detained for questioning. By tomorrow morning, your legal counsel will have access to you. And between now and then, every piece of documentation in your possession that relates to Lyra Ashvale, the Seer Network, the bond evidence, and the framing of a conspiracy charge in the 3rd year of my reign will be in my hands." Vane looked at him. "And if I don't cooperate?" "Then I spend the next month pulling the threads myself, and the investigation takes longer, and the damage to the houses associated with you is broader and less controlled." Draven held his gaze. "I'm offering you the option to contain your own exposure. That's more than you offered her." Vane said nothing for a long moment. Then, "Castle is involved." "I know. More than you know." "Then tell me." Vane's jaw tightened. He looked for the first time like a man who was doing a real calculation rather than a performed one. The difference between a strategist managing appearances and a strategist trying to survive. "There are documents," he said, "in the Eastern Archive. You won't find them in my possession because I made sure they weren't in my possession. Castle holds the originals. But I have copies, in a location my legal counsel knows." He paused. "I'll authorize access, in exchange for the controlled disclosure option." "Authorized," Draven said. He stood and looked at Aldrich, who had the particular expression of a man who had just watched a situation he'd been dreading resolve itself more cleanly than he'd prepared for, and wasn't sure whether to feel relieved or suspicious. "Take him up, upper security wing, as stated. No isolation. He gets meals, council access, writing materials." Draven turned. "And I want the documentation before morning." Aldrich nodded once and began moving Vane down the corridor with the efficient, impersonal handling of a professional doing a job. Morrow was organizing the rest of the guards, dealing with the injured man whose shoulder would need a surgeon. Sarah was already moving, efficient and quiet. Draven turned back to the cell. Lyra was still standing in the center of it. The lamp above her was burning steadily, and in its light she looked exactly like what she was, a woman who had survived something that should have destroyed her and had not been improved by the experience in the ways people sometimes claimed. Survival improved you, but had been sharpened by it, made more precise, stripped down to whatever was essential. She was looking at him with those dark, steady eyes. "You should probably come out of there," he said. "Probably," she agreed, and didn't move immediately. He waited. She took one slow breath, looked at the cell, at the walls, at the bed, at the lamp she'd lived under for 5 years, with the particular look of someone who has been in a space so long they've stopped seeing it and are now, suddenly, seeing it again from the outside, the way it actually was. Then she walked through the door. She stopped beside him in the corridor, and the bond proximity hit him again, sharper for the movement, for her being in motion and close. He held it. He didn't reach for her. That wasn't his to take. Not yet. Not by right. Not when the gap between them was measured in years of suffering he'd been the origin point of, however unknowing. "Where are we going?" she said. "Upper levels. I'll have quarters arranged." Not my quarters. No, not mine either. He met her eyes. Somewhere with a lock you control, a fire, hot food, a physician if you want one. She looked at him for a moment. Then, with the slight edge of a woman who had spent 5 years dealing in precision, I want all three. Done. They walked down the corridor toward the stairs, and Draven was acutely, painfully conscious of her moving beside him. The sound of her feet on the stone, her breathing, the slight tension in her frame that was not fear but the sustained alertness of a person who had learned not to trust changes in their situation until those changes had proven themselves. He didn't blame her. He was, if he was honest with himself, still processing the specific horror of what he'd just learned. Not in its full weight, not yet, because the full weight would take time and privacy, neither of which he currently had. What he had was the outline of it, which was sufficient for now. That his own seal had been used to bury a woman in his foundations. That the men who'd handed him the paperwork had known exactly what they were doing. That for 5 years he'd searched the world for something that had been beneath his feet the entire time because someone had put it there deliberately. He had his mate. He had evidence of a conspiracy that reached to the highest levels of his noble council. He had Vane in custody and documentation incoming and a thread that led directly to Castle. And as they reached the base of the first staircase and Lyra stopped and looked up toward light, toward levels of the keep she hadn't seen in years, Draven's runner appeared at the top of the stairs, sliding to a halt on the stone steps with the expression of someone carrying information they hadn't had time to process into sense. Your Majesty, the runner was breathing hard. Commander Aldrich said to find you immediately if anything came through from the gatewatch. He caught his breath. Lord Castle's household, 40 riders, armed, approaching the south road. They're flying full house colors. Lyra's head turned. She looked at Draven, and her expression held something that was not surprise and not quite satisfaction either, the look of a woman who had run this scenario in her head many times and was watching it play out on schedule. He knows Vane's been taken, she said. Yes. And he's coming to finish what Vane couldn't, or to negotiate from a position of force before the documents get to me. She held his gaze for one long moment in the stairwell light, with the sound of the keep moving above them and 40 armed riders on the south road and 5 years of conspiracy beginning to surface like wreckage after a storm. Then we don't have until morning, she said. No, Draven said. We have until they reach the gate. They had 12 minutes. Draven calculated it on the move. South Road approach at riding pace, the gate watch delay, the time it took 40 armed men to dismount and form up in a way that communicated intent without triggering an immediate military response. 12 minutes between the runner's report and Cassell's riders reaching a position where this became something that couldn't be walked back. He used 8 of them to get Lyra to the upper residential wing, not his quarters. A guest suite on the east corridor, one he'd verified years ago, had a secondary exit through the servant passage, the kind of architectural detail that most kings never bothered to learn because most kings assumed their walls would always hold. He'd learned his walls' vulnerabilities before he'd learned their strengths. It was the only reason he'd kept the throne long enough for any of this to matter. He put her in the room. A fire was already burning. The household staff had been alerted, someone had moved fast, and there was food on the table, the practical kind, bread and cold meat, and a ceramic pot of something hot. Lyra stood in the center of the room and looked at it. She didn't move toward the food. She stood very still, and her eyes moved across the space with the systematic attention of someone cataloging exits, sight lines, and potential threats before they allowed themselves to register comfort. It was the behavior of a person who had learned at some deep cellular level that comfort was a vulnerability until proven otherwise. Draven recognized it because he'd trained himself out of it at 22 by sheer force of will, and it had cost him something he'd never fully named. The secondary exit is behind the third panel on the left wall, he said. It opens inward. The passage leads to the kitchen level, and from there to the east courtyard. She looked at him. I'm telling you, he said, not so you'll run, so you know it's there. A beat. Then she moved to the table and sat down and picked up the bread with the matter-of-fact efficiency of a woman who had decided that eating was a tactical decision and not a sentimental one. "Go deal with Castle, Sal," she said. "I'm not going anywhere." He went. Bam. The gate watch had held Castle's riders at the outer approach, which was correct procedure and bought time. Draven reached the south wall parapet with Aldrich 30 seconds before Castle himself rode to the front of the formation and looked up. Edric Cassel on horseback looked different than Edric Cassel in a reception hall. Larger. The 60-year-old body that moved with careful deliberateness in council rooms sat a horse with the muscle memory of a man who had spent his formative decades in military campaigns before transitioning to the more profitable violence of politics. He was wearing riding armor, functional, not ceremonial, and behind him 40 riders sat with weapons sheathed, but hands resting in positions that were not casual. "Your Majesty," Castle called up, and his voice carried the specific calibration of a man who had been projecting authority across distances for decades. "I've come to discuss a matter of some urgency." 40 armed men is a discussion, Draven said. "It's not a subtle one. I heard Lord Vane was detained. Lord Vane is being held for questioning related to an investigation." "Into what?" "Into whatever a 40-rider response to his detention suggests you're afraid I'll find." Draven set both hands on the parapet stone and looked down. "Castle, you came here at night with a war party. We both know what that means. The question is whether you want to have the conversation that gets you through that gate, or the conversation that keeps you outside it." Silence below. The horses shifted. One of the riders in the middle of the formation exchanged a glance with the man beside him. A small thing, a half-second thing. But from the parapet height, it was visible in a way it wouldn't have been from ground level. Not a nervous glance, a checking glance, confirming something. Draven filed it. "Open the gate," Castle said. "Let me come in. No weapons drawn. My men stay outside. You and I talk like the men we are." "Like the men we are," Draven repeated. "All right." Aldrich turned to him immediately. "Draven, open it. He has 40 men on the South Road, and you want to let him walk in. I want to know what he says when he's standing in front of me with no exit available." Draven moved off the parapet toward the stairs. "Because right now he's saying what a man says when he's testing from a distance. I need to hear what he says at close range." Aldrich followed, because that was what Aldrich did, and the gate opened. They met in the south anteroom, a functional space, not a throne room, with a table and chairs and the honest lighting of wall-mounted torches rather than the political staging of chandeliers and dais. Draven sat. Cassel sat across from him. Aldrich stood at the door. Cassel looked, in person and at close range, like a man who had made a decision on the ride over and was now committed to it. There was a particular quality of stillness in him that Draven recognized from his own experience, the stillness of someone who has stopped calculating options and started executing the one they chose. That was more dangerous than uncertainty. "Vane talked," Castle said. Not a question. "He offered documentation in exchange for controlled disclosure." "Then you know about the Eastern Archive." "I know it exists. I know you hold the originals." Draven held his gaze. "I'm giving you the same option I gave Vane. Controlled disclosure. Your cooperation on the record, the investigation stays focused on actions rather than character, and whatever exposure you have gets contained to what's actually relevant." Castle looked at him for a long moment. Then he said, "Aldrich." And Draven understood, in the half-second before anything happened, that the name wasn't directed at the man at the door as a means of getting his attention. It was a signal. Aldrich moved. Not toward Castle, toward Draven. And the movement had the specific quality of something rehearsed, precise, executed without hesitation, the body doing what it had decided to do before the mind had to sign off on it again. Draven's hands were on the table, and before he could clear them, Aldrich's hand came down on his right wrist, and a second man, a man who had not been in the anteroom when they'd walked in, who had been behind the interior door that Draven had not checked because it was inside his own keep, and he had assumed it was clear, pressed something cold against the back of his neck. A blade. Short, held flat. The kind of precision placement that was not a threat, but a fact. The room stopped. Draven did not move. He sat with his wrist pinned to the table and a blade at his neck and looked at Edric Castle, and the thing that happened inside his chest in that moment was not fear. It was something colder than fear and quieter. The specific quality of a man who has just discovered that the thing he trusted most in the world was the thing that gave him away. Not Cassel, not Vane. Aldrich. 16 years, since before the throne. Since Draven had been a 20-year-old second son who hadn't expected to inherit anything and had needed desperately someone who knew how the court worked and was willing to show him without wanting something obvious in return. Aldrich had been that person. Aldrich had been the map when Draven didn't know the territory. He had handed Aldrich everything in the incremental ways that trust worked. A piece here, a confidence there, access to information and timing and strategy that no enemy could have purchased and no surveillance could have extracted. All of it sitting in Castle's hands. "I'm sorry," Aldrich said. His voice was even. That was the worst part. Not cracking, not tight with guilt or performance of guilt. Just even. The voice of a man who had been carrying this decision for long enough that it had finished hurting. "How long?" Draven said. "Since before you were king." "Since my father." "Since before your father, if we're being exact about it." Castle leaned back in his chair with the ease of a man who had just shifted the terms of an encounter entirely in his favor. "Aldrich's family has been associated with my house for 2 generations. That's not a betrayal, Your Majesty. That's a relationship that predates your claim to relevance." Draven said nothing. His mind was moving, not through emotion but through the cold, practical terrain of an immediate problem. The blade at his neck, the grip on his wrist, the man behind him, whose breathing he could now catalog. Young, controlled, trained, but not veteran. And the distance between his current position and 3 possible vectors of response. The anteroom had 1 exterior door and 2 interior doors. Aldrich stood between him and the exterior. The man with the blade controlled the space directly behind him. Castle had no weapon drawn. Castle was not a physical threat. Castle was a directional threat, the source of instruction. "You went down to those cells tonight," Castle said, "and you found her. I knew you would, eventually." Vane's containment was always a temporary measure. He folded his hands on the table with the neat gesture of a man settling into a negotiation he'd been anticipating for years. The question was never whether you'd find the bond. The question was what position I needed to be in when you did. And this is the position. This is the position. You, temporarily inconvenienced. The woman upstairs, currently alone in a room that my man on the household staff, yes, I have had one for 4 years, you're welcome to be angry about that, can access through the servant passage you told her about yourself. Castle paused. Which means, in about 7 minutes, she's no longer a variable you control. The cold in Draven's chest became something else. Not panic. He had burned out the mechanism for panic sometime in his mid-20s, but beneath the ice, something moved. Something that had no tactical name, that lived in the part of him that had spent 5 years pulling toward a woman through a bond he couldn't locate, that had found her 3 hours ago in a dungeon cell and had not yet had the time to understand what finding her meant, only that losing her again was a category of outcome he was not able to process as acceptable. He looked at Aldrich. Aldrich was looking at the wall. "What do you want?" Draven said to Castle. "What I've always wanted. Abdication in favor of a managed council succession. Your life and hers, in exchange for a clean transfer. You go somewhere quiet. She goes with you if you insist. I have no particular interest in her once she's no longer politically relevant." Castle's voice held the specific gentleness of a man offering something he'd already decided was generous. "This is the best version of how this ends. The other version is messier for everyone." Draven's right hand was pinned. His left was on the table, not pinned, which was either an oversight or a test. He looked at the table surface, at the torch placement, at the angle of Aldrich's body. He had 5 minutes before someone came through the servant passage into the room where Lyra was. She'd seen the exit. He'd told her. He had told her exactly where it was and exactly where it led, and he had told her it was there so she'd know, not so she'd run. But right now he needed her to run. He had no way to tell her. His only option was to not be in this room when Castle's man reached the servant passage. Draven looked at Aldrich one more time, not with accusation, because accusation was a luxury, and not with grief, because grief was slower than he needed to be right now. Just looked, the way you look at a country you're leaving, getting the shape of it fixed in your memory before you go. Then he moved. Left hand flat to the table's surface, shove. Not at Aldrich, not at the blade, at the table itself. The edge catching Castle in the sternum as it drove forward, and the man across the table went back hard in his chair. The grip on his right wrist wrenched as he came up, and he took the pain and used the rotation to pull the man behind him off his angle. The blade dragged across his shoulder, not deep, not the neck it had been aimed for. And he drove his elbow back and felt it connect with something facial, the soft crunch of cartilage. The man went down. Aldrich came at him, and Draven did the thing he'd never expected to do, had spent 16 years hoping never to have occasion to do, and hit his commander in the throat with the heel of his hand. Aldrich dropped, gasping, not dead. He'd pulled it, and he didn't know why he'd pulled it, some residual piece of 16 years that his hand remembered, even when his judgment said otherwise. Castle was scrambling up from the overturned chair. Draven was already at the interior door. He went through the keep at speed, through corridors he knew by the specific quality of their darkness, by the sounds they made, by the cold drafts that came through particular junctions of wall and floor. He had 4 minutes, maybe 3. He hit the east corridor running and didn't stop. The suite door was unlocked. He went through it, and the room was empty. The fire burning, the food half-eaten, the third panel on the left wall standing open. She'd already gone. For one moment, one single moment that he would not later admit to, he stood in the center of the empty room and felt the specific weight of a man who has found the same thing twice in one night and lost it just as fast. Then he heard, from the direction of the passage, a sound. Not a scream. Not a struggle. A single sharp impact, something hitting a wall, and then silence. He went through the panel. The passage was narrow and dark and smelled like old stone and kitchen smoke. And 10 feet in, he found Castle's man on the floor with his hands over his face and Lyra standing over him with a ceramic pitcher, now missing its base, held in her right hand like she was deciding whether she needed to use it again. She looked up. "He came through from the other end," she said. "I know. I handled it. I can see that." Draven looked at the man on the floor, who was breathing and was going to have a significant headache and was not going to be a problem in the next 5 minutes. Then he looked at Lyra, who was breathing hard but steady, her dark eyes clear, the silver mark on her wrist catching the faint light from the passage. "Aldrich," she said. She'd read it in his face. "Aldrich." She absorbed it, didn't perform a reaction, just held the information and let it settle into whatever structure she was building of this night, this situation, this man in front of her, and everything that came with him. "How many people do you actually trust?" she said. He thought about it honestly. "Fewer than I did 3 hours ago," he said. She nodded once, like that was the right answer. Outside, somewhere in the keep above them, Draven heard the sound of doors. Multiple doors, fast movement, the percussive pattern of a building shifting into crisis mode. Castle had people moving. However many he'd gotten through the gate, however many were already inside, they were moving now. And Draven Blackthorn, Alpha King of the Ashenvale Empire, stood in a servant passage with a split shoulder and a shattered inner circle, and the woman he'd spent 5 years searching for, who had just taken down a trained operative with a ceramic pitcher and was looking at him with eyes that were asking the same question he was asking himself. What kind of man are you going to be right now? Not the king he'd constructed, not the authority he'd maintained, not the controlled, careful, information-managed ruler who had built an empire on knowing exactly who held what and never showing his hand until he was certain. That man had just been gutted by the person he'd trusted most, which meant the man who walked out of this passage was going to have to be something else. "There's a room," Draven said, "in the North Tower. My father built it. Nobody knows it exists except me." He held her gaze. "We go there. We think. And then we decide what we're willing to do to end this." Lyra looked at him for one long measuring moment in the dark passage. "Lead," she said. The North Tower room smelled like his father. That was the first thing Draven registered when he pushed the concealed door open. Old cedar, old iron, the specific combination of materials his father had favored in the spaces he actually used versus the spaces he performed authority in. A small room, stone-walled, with a narrow window that faced the inner courtyard and a table that had been there since before Draven was born. A weapons rack on one wall, stripped now but still holding the shape of what it had once carried. A single chair. He hadn't been in here in 3 years. Lyra came through after him, and he closed the door, and the sounds of the keep became muffled. Not gone, but distant, filtered through 8 inches of old stone and the particular quiet that rooms acquire when they've been left alone long enough. She looked around at once, assessing, then turned her attention to the window. She stood to the side of it, not in front of it. Instinctive positioning, not silhouetted against the light. Something in Draven's chest registered that without comment. Below, the inner courtyard was moving. He could see torch carriers, fast-moving figures. The organized urgency of people executing orders. Some of those people were his, some of them were Castle's. And the problem was that, from 3 floors up in bad light, the difference wasn't clear. That was the architecture of the betrayal. It hadn't broken his keep by force. It had made his keep illegible to him. He couldn't read his own house anymore, couldn't trust the chain of command that ran through Aldrich, couldn't issue orders and be certain they'd reach the people he intended rather than the people Castle had positioned. Aldrich had been his voice in this building for 16 years. Draven pressed that fact into a corner of his mind and locked it. Not because it didn't matter, because it mattered too much to think about right now, and surviving the next 6 hours was a prerequisite for everything else, including the particular reckoning that came after. "How many people report directly to you?" Lyra said. "Not through Aldrich, directly." He thought fast. "Morrow, Sarah, 3 members of the Gate Watch I appointed personally last year. My household physician, Bren Vault." The woman with the ledger. He looked at her. "You know about that?" "I know about most things that move through this keep. Sound travels differently than people expect in deep stone buildings." She kept her eyes on the courtyard. "The staff rotation on level 7 came through my door twice a year. I heard names." 5 years of listening. 5 years of building a map of his keep from the sounds that reached a cell on its lowest occupied level. He didn't know whether to call that survival or something that required a word that hadn't been coined yet. "Bren is reachable through the kitchen corridor," he said. "If I can get a message to her, she can move through the residential wing without drawing attention. The staff don't register household management as a security variable. Castle will. Castle can't watch every door." He turned from the window and went to the weapons rack. Stripped as it was, the mounting brackets were still solid iron, and behind the rear bracket his father had built a small recess that Draven had found at 14 while cataloging the room after his father's death. Inside it, a sealed case. He broke the seal, opened it. 2 short blades, field quality, oiled and wrapped. A folded document in his father's handwriting that he had read once and put back and never read again. He took the blades. "Take one," he said. Lyra crossed the room and took the blade without ceremony, turned it in her hand once to check balance and edge, and slid it into the back of her waistband with the matter-of-fact efficiency of someone who had done that particular motion before. He noted it, filed it, did not ask. "The document in the Eastern Archive," she said. "The originals Castle holds. What do you think they contain?" "The framing evidence. Whatever fabricated testimony or manufactured conspiracy records they built your case on. Possibly communication records showing the coordination, Vane and Castle and whoever else participated in getting you into that cell." He buckled the second blade at his hip. "If those documents exist and reach the assembly houses before Castle controls the narrative, he loses his political base. The Eastern Compact falls. His riders outside become men without authorization, and the Gatewatch can treat them accordingly. So we need the documents. We need the documents to be in the hands of people who will use them. Assembly witnesses, independent scribes, the border commanders who answer to imperial law rather than house allegiances." He looked at her directly. "And we need Castle on record before he realizes that's the play." Lyra was quiet for a moment. Then, "He has Aldrich." "Yes. Aldrich knows everything you know, every contingency, every safeguard, every relationship you've built for 16 years. She held his gaze, not gently, with the honest directness of a woman who had spent years dealing only in what was actually true because pretense was a resource she hadn't been able to afford. Whatever move you think is unexpected, Aldrich helped you develop the habit of making it. The weight of that landed in Draven's chest and sat there. She was right. That was the complete architecture of what Aldrich's defection meant. Not just the loss of a commander, not just the operational exposure, but the evacuation of every strategic instinct Draven had ever shown another person. Aldrich had been in the room for all of it. The decisions, the doubts, the particular way Draven's mind moved when he was under pressure. The man who knew him best was now in Castle's possession. "Then I don't use any play Aldrich has seen," Draven said. "He's seen them all. He's seen everything I've done in 16 years of being the man he knew." Draven looked at the window, at the courtyard, at his keep moving in patterns that no longer told him the truth. "He hasn't seen what I do when I have nothing left to lose and someone worth fighting for." Lyra looked at him for a long moment. Something moved in her expression that she didn't try to name, and he didn't try to name for her. "Then show me," she said. Brenvault received the message through the kitchen corridor exactly as Draven had planned, delivered by a scullery worker who owed Bren a favor from 3 winters back and didn't know what she was carrying. Bren appeared at the North Tower's lower access point 11 minutes later with the compressed, purposeful energy of a woman who had been waiting for something to do since the moment she'd handed Draven the ledger and walked out of his study. She brought information. Cassell's man on the household staff was named Terrace, a supply coordinator who had been in the position for 4 years. He was currently in the West Wing, which meant he was not currently a problem. Aldrich had been moved, not to a cell, but to the war room, which told Draven that Castle was using him as an operational asset rather than holding him as a prisoner. That distinction mattered. Castle himself was in the main reception hall, which was either confidence or theater or both. The riders outside the south gate had not been given entry to the keep proper. That was the gate watch holding, which meant at least some of Draven's direct appointments were still functioning as appointed. "The Assembly scribes," Draven said, "the 2 who travel with the Imperial record." Bren didn't hesitate. "East Residential, room 12. They've been there since this afternoon, and as far as I know, no one's told them anything about what's happening." Assembly scribes were independent officers. Their function predated any individual noble house, and their documentation carried weight that personal testimony didn't. If Castle's documents were presented to assembly scribes with the proper chain of custody, they became part of the Imperial record. Immovable, public. The kind of evidence that couldn't be suppressed without suppressing the entire institutional framework that gave the noble houses their legitimacy, which meant Castle would not want those scribes anywhere near those documents, which meant getting the documents to those scribes in the next hour before Cassell thought to secure them was the play that Aldrich had never seen Draven make because Draven had never needed to make it. "I need Morrow," Draven said. "He came looking for you 20 minutes ago," Bren said. "I put him in the linen storage off the east corridor. He's not happy about it." "Get him," thought. Morrow was not happy about it. He was also, when Draven laid out the objective in 3 sentences, immediately operational. That was the quality Draven had hired him for. The ability to shift from personal feeling to professional function without requiring a transition period. The tracker's eyes went from irritated to focused in the time it took Draven to finish speaking. "The Eastern Archive," Morrow said. "Castle's personal seal. That's inside the keep proper? Guest vault, East Wing, subfloor 1. Castle has used the same guest vault for 12 years and his seal codes his personal storage there." Draven looked at him. "I need those documents intact. I need them witnessed by the assembly scribes in room 12 of the East Residential. And I need that to happen before Castle realizes it's in motion." "Sarah's available," Morrow said. "2 others from my team who don't report through Aldrich's chain. 4 people and no more. Speed over force." Morrow nodded and left. Draven turned to Lyra, who had been standing against the wall of the narrow passage they'd moved through from the tower, listening with the focused stillness of someone building a complete picture before they spoke. "You should stay here," he said. "No," she said. "Lyra, he did this to keep me out of the board," she said. and her voice was flat with a precision that stopped him. He put me in a cell for 5 years to keep me from being a variable he couldn't control. I am not staying in a passage while you go finish it. She looked at him with eyes that had 5 years of deliberate purpose behind them. I know this keep better than you think. I know the sounds, the rhythms, who moves where and when. I have been listening to this building for 5 years with nothing else to do. He looked at her. Where does Castle position his personal security when he's in an exposed building? He said, testing it. 2 at the primary entry, 1 on the exit route he hasn't visibly identified, 1 mobile who checks in on a circuit. She held his gaze. He's been in this keep enough times for me to have mapped his pattern from the guard rotation sounds. His mobile security circuit hits the East Wing junction every 11 minutes. Draven said nothing for 3 seconds. Stay behind me in the open corridors, he said. Done. They moved through Blackthorn Keep like water finding cracks. Not through the main corridors, through the routes that didn't register as routes. The maintenance access between the kitchen level and the East Wing. The space behind the formal dining room that had been built for serving access, and now just connected 2 wings of the keep in a way nobody used because the formal dining room hadn't been used in 2 years. The servant stairs that ran parallel to the main stairs and were narrower and darker and completely unwatched because watching servant stairs required stationing people at intervals, and Castle hadn't brought enough men inside the keep to cover everything. He'd miscalculated. Not badly. He'd covered the primary routes, the obvious positions, the places a king retreated to. What he hadn't covered was the infrastructure of the building itself, the bone structure beneath the visible architecture, because that knowledge required 16 years of actually living in a place rather than visiting it as a political actor. Lyra moved without hesitation through spaces Draven was finding by memory, and she was finding by something else. The accumulated geography of 5 years of sound, of learning to read a building from the inside out, from the sounds of feet above, and water in pipes and drafts that told you where openings were without seeing them. She stopped him twice at junctions he would have walked through, and both times, 8 or 9 seconds later, footsteps passed the junction from the other side. He didn't say anything. He stored it. The East Wing subfloor was empty when they reached it. Morrow's team had already passed through. The guest vault door showed the signs of clean, fast professional work, the lock mechanism disengaged without visible damage, the door resting at a specific angle that told Draven someone had propped it for quick re-entry. Inside, Morrow was at the storage bank with Sarah at his back, going through the sealed cases with systematic speed. He looked up when Draven entered. Found it, Morrow said. He held up a document case bearing Cassell's personal seal. Unopened. Draven took it. The seal was intact. He looked at the case, the weight of it, the size, the specific quality of the materials that told you the person who'd had it made hadn't been cutting costs. This was a man who'd expected these documents to exist for a long time and had invested in their preservation accordingly. Assembly scribes, he said. Sarah's already gone to clear the route, Morrow said. They moved. The east residential corridor was 1 floor up and 1 wing over, which in the geography of Blackthorn Keep's east section meant a specific junction that Castle's mobile security covered on its 11-minute circuit. Lyra had called 11 minutes. Draven checked his internal count from the last time she'd stopped him. They had 4 minutes on the circuit, possibly 5. They made it to room 12 in 3. The assembly scribes were 2 men in their 50s who had the look of people who had been woken from sleep and were processing that fact with the methodical patience of professionals who'd learned that most crises, handled correctly, became documentation rather than emergencies. They looked at Draven without visible alarm, which was either professionalism or the specific composure of men who'd been in enough unusual situations that a king arriving in a servant corridor at night with a blade on his hip and a woman behind him carrying evidence didn't immediately exceed their range of experience. Your Majesty, the senior scribe said, I need these documents witnessed as received from the king's hand in the presence of the imperial record keepers, Draven said, time-stamped, signed, and logged as evidence in an active investigation. The scribe looked at the case, at the seal, back at Draven. The investigation concerns conspiracy against the crown, falsification of criminal charges, unlawful detention of a fated bond partner of the reigning king. Draven set the case on the table. The detained party is present and can provide direct testimony. Both scribes looked at Lyra. Lyra looked back at them with the particular steadiness of a woman who had spent 5 years rehearsing this moment without knowing when it would come and was now delivering it without ornamentation. "My name is Lyra Ashvale," she said. "I was imprisoned in the 7th level of this keep for 5 years under false conspiracy charges authorized by documentation I was never shown, in a proceeding I was never formally present for, coordinated by Lord Harlan Vane and Lord Edric Castle to prevent my bond claim on the king from affecting their succession strategy." The senior scribe reached for his record materials without being asked. The noise started below them 12 minutes later. Not subtle noise, the noise of a building's equilibrium breaking. Voices carrying through stone at a pitch and volume that meant people had stopped managing appearances. The sound of boots moving fast and in numbers that indicated organized response rather than patrol. Castle had realized what was in motion. Draven looked at Morrow. "How long to complete the witness documentation?" 20 minutes minimum for full legal wait." From below, the sounds of doors. The specific percussion of a keep shifting into confrontation mode. Not the managed crisis of the earlier hours, but something raw. The noise of a man who has watched his strategy collapse and is now operating on the instinct to overwhelm rather than outmaneuver. "Buy me 20 minutes, Draven said. Morrow looked at him with the eyes of a man doing a realistic calculation. Against how many? "Whatever castle can move through the East Wing in the next 20 minutes. Morrow nodded once. "Sarah." The tracker woman, who had returned to the corridor, met his eyes, and the two of them moved without further discussion, pulling the 2 remaining team members with them, flowing into the corridor with the coordinated instinct of people whose professional lives had trained them to compress decisions into physical motion. Draven closed the room door and turned to the scribes. "Keep writing," he said. He stood at the door with his hand on the blade at his hip and listened to the sounds of his keep below him, the movement patterns changing, accelerating, converging on the East Wing with the deliberate pressure of a man who had run out of subtle options and was now using the last tool available to him, which was force and the threat of force, and the calculation that Draven couldn't let evidence be witnessed while managing a physical confrontation simultaneously. Castle wasn't wrong about the calculation. He was wrong about Draven. Because Draven was standing in a room with a door between him and whatever came next, and behind him a woman was giving testimony to imperial scribes that was getting written into the permanent record of the Empire word by word. And the thing he understood now, the thing that Aldrich had never seen him understand because he'd never had occasion to reach it, was that there were situations where you stopped managing the variables and you just held the line. You held the line because the thing behind you was worth holding for. The sounds in the corridor below got louder, then closer. Then the door at the end of the east residential corridor opened, and Draven heard Morrow's voice, sharp and commanding, followed by the sound of impact. The brutal, percussion-heavy sound of a real fight in a narrow space. Not the restrained engagement of the dungeon corridor, but something harder and less controlled. He kept his hand on the blade. He kept his eyes on the door. Behind him, the scribe's pen moved steadily. The fight in the corridor went bad at the 2-minute mark. He could hear it in the sounds. The pattern shifting, more voices, more weight, the specific quality of a tactical situation tilting against smaller numbers in a confined space. Morrow's team was disciplined, but they were 4 against what sounded like significantly more. And then the corridor door at the near end, the one directly outside room 12, opened. Not Morrow, not Sarah, Aldrich. He stood in the doorway with a short blade in his right hand and the specific expression of a man who had made a choice he was living with, which was different from a man who was at peace with it. He was favoring his left side. Draven's elbow to his throat had done something to the shoulder, damage traveling up from the impact point, the way force moved through a body. His eyes were steady. They had always been steady. That was the thing about Aldrich that Draven had trusted, that steadiness, not knowing that it existed independent of loyalty. "Move away from the door," Aldrich said. Behind Draven, the pen kept moving. "How long?" Draven said. How long did you know about Lyra? Something shifted in Aldrich's face. Not the steadiness, that held. Something underneath it. Since the week before the hearing. And you signed off on the evidence review. I did. You stood next to me when I signed the detention order. Yes. The pen moved. Draven looked at the man who had been the closest thing he had to a genuine ally for 16 years and felt the specific weight of that fact. Not as grief, not yet, but as information. The way you feel the edge of a wound before the pain registers, the body knowing the damage before the mind catches up. She was innocent, Draven said. I know. You knew then. Yes. The words sat in the room like a stone dropped in still water. Aldrich held the blade at his side, not raised, not threatening, present, the way a drawn weapon is always present regardless of its angle. Castle has the rest of the East Wing, Aldrich said. Morrow's team is finished. There's no version of this where the documents don't come back to him. He looked at Draven with the exhausted directness of a man who has moved past argument. You're done, Draven. Let me walk you out before it gets uglier. The documentation is already witnessed, Lyra said. Aldrich looked at her, past Draven, at the woman standing beside the scribe's table with the silver mark visible on her wrist and 5 years of wrongful imprisonment in her body and absolute steadiness in her voice. 2 signatures are logged, she said. Whatever happens to us, whatever happens to those papers, it's in the Imperial record. Tampering with the Imperial record in front of witnesses is a different crime than the one Castle thought he was committing tonight. She held Aldrich's gaze. He miscalculated, because he didn't account for a woman who had nothing to do for 5 years but learn exactly how Imperial documentation law works. The silence stretched, and then from the corridor behind Aldrich came a voice, Castle's voice, carrying the specific quality of a man who was done waiting and was ending things himself. Bring them out, Aldrich, all 3 of them. Aldrich stood in the doorway between Draven and that voice. His blade was at his side. His eyes were on Draven. And in the 2 seconds that followed, something happened in Aldrich's expression that Draven, who had known this man for 16 years and had spent 3 hours learning the true shape of that knowledge, couldn't fully read. Something moving behind the steadiness, something turning over, some weight shifting on a scale that had been balanced a particular way for a very long time. Aldrich, Cassel said again, harder. Aldrich looked at Draven. The north exit of this corridor, he said, very quietly. 40 feet, maintenance hatch, leads to the outer wall walk. Your gate watch is still yours. Draven didn't move. Go, Aldrich said. And behind him, filling the corridor with the weight of a man who has run out of patience and is now prepared to end things by force, Castle stepped into view with 6 armed men at his back and looked at the scene in front of him. Aldrich in the doorway, Draven on the other side of it, the scribes behind Draven with their record materials and their witness documentation, and understood in one rapid assessment that something had just changed. What are you doing? Cassel said to Aldrich, and his voice had gone cold. Aldrich turned to face him, and Draven grabbed Lyra's wrist and ran. The wall walk was cold and open, and the night sky above it was the kind of clear that only happened after long, cold spells, every star present and accounted for, the kind of sky that made you feel the size of things you usually managed not to think about. Draven and Lyra came through the maintenance hatch at a run and hit the outer wall walk in the dark, and he pulled her left toward the north gatehouse because that was where his direct appointments were stationed, and that was the only direction that had any logic left in it. Behind them, through the stone, they could hear the keep moving, the deep percussion of a building in crisis, voices and boots, and the organized chaos of people executing competing orders in the same space. They ran. The shoulder wound from the blade in the anteroom had stiffened during the hours in the tower room and was now making itself loudly known, each stride pulling at the damaged tissue with a persistence that wasn't debilitating but was relentless. He ran through it. Pain was information. Right now, the information was manageable, and the alternative to managing it was worse. Lyra ran without complaint beside him. Whatever 5 years of inadequate food and no open space had done to her body, it hadn't taken her capacity for sustained motion. She ran with her head down and her arms working and the short blade from the North Tower room visible at her back. And she didn't ask where they were going or how far or what happened when they got there. She trusted the direction. Not blindly. He understood that. She had spent enough time in the dark calculating odds that she didn't trust anything blindly. She trusted the direction because she'd run the same calculation he had and arrived at the same answer. The North Gatehouse was 40 feet ahead when the door at the far end of the wall walk opened. 3 men. House colors he didn't recognize in the dark, which meant either Castle had people he hadn't accounted for or Vane's household had mobilized in ways he hadn't tracked. Either way, 3 armed men between him and the gatehouse, and the wall walk was exactly as narrow as a wall walk was, which was not wide enough to go around. Draven didn't slow down. He'd learned something at some point in the years of running an empire from the front instead of the back that he'd never been able to fully articulate to anyone, including Aldrich. That the men who hit obstacles hardest were rarely the biggest or the most trained. They were the men who had decided, somewhere before the obstacle appeared, that stopping was not a category of available response. The decision came first. The body followed. He hit the first man at full speed, and the impact was mutual and ugly, and they went into the wall walk railing together and the railing held, which was the relevant outcome. The second man had his weapon halfway out when Draven's blade cleared the scabbard, and the engagement became specific and close and faster than thought. Not skill exactly, or not only skill, but the particular economy of motion that happened when a man was operating past the point where he was managing his own performance and was just executing. The third man stepped back. He stepped back because Lyra was there, the short blade in her right hand and her weight forward, and her eyes on him with an expression that communicated, with complete clarity and no theatrical elaboration, that she had spent 5 years waiting for the opportunity to be in exactly this kind of position and was fully prepared to use it. The third man looked at her, then at the blade, then at Draven, who was upright and breathing hard with 2 men on the wall, walk floor and blood on his right hand that might be his own or might not be. He dropped his weapon. Smart, Lyra said. They went past him and into the North Gatehouse at a pace that was no longer running, but was not slow. The Gatewatch commander was a woman named Petra Solt, 34 years old, direct appointment from 14 months back, whose record Draven had reviewed 3 times before offering her the position because the record was almost too clean and he'd wanted to understand what that meant. It meant she was genuinely that good at her job, which he'd confirmed over the subsequent year. And it meant she was sitting in the gatehouse when Draven came through the door, and she stood up without a word and looked at him with the expression of a person who had been waiting for instruction through a chaotic night and was very glad to finally have someone in front of her who could provide it. Report, he said. Castle's 40 riders are still outside the south gate, holding position. They haven't attempted entry by force. She paused. There's been communication from inside the keep. Someone tried to send an order to open the south gate about 20 minutes ago. The order didn't come through your seal protocol, so I held it. Good. The east wing is contested. I've had sound reports through the wall guards, but no visibility. She looked at Lyra with the professional neutrality of a soldier registering an unknown variable and waiting for categorization. This is Lyra Ashvale, Draven said. She is to be treated as under my direct protection. Any order that doesn't come through me personally regarding her movement or detention is to be disregarded. Petra looked at Lyra for exactly 1 second, then she nodded. Lord Castle, Draven said. Where is he? Last known position, East Wing Upper Corridor, approximately 12 minutes ago, according to the internal runner network. She moved to the gatehouse map table, which had the keep's layout rendered in chalk on a flat board, a working document, updated regularly, current. The assembly scribes are still in East Residential 12. The runner who passed that reported voices inside, active, and no signs of forced entry. The scribes were still working. The documents were still being recorded. Draven looked at the map, and the clarity that had been building through the chaos of the last hours settled into something he recognized. Not calm, not the false calm of a man performing composure, but the specific quality of a situation that had found its own shape. The variables were no longer multiplying. They were resolving. Send a runner to every gatewatch station with my direct seal, he said. Full lock. Nobody moves in or out of this keep without my verbal authorization. Then I need Castle. "Sir," Petra said, and moved. Amman. They brought Cassell to the main hall, not the reception hall where he'd been holding position. The main hall, the formal one, the room that had been built to communicate the weight of the throne to everyone who stood in it. Draven had not planned it as theater. He'd chosen it because it was the largest space in the keep with the most exits he controlled, which was practical. But as Cassell was walked in by 4 of Petra's gate watch soldiers, the effect of the room was working regardless of intent. Cassell looked diminished in it. Not physically. He was still the same wide-chested 60-year-old who'd entered the south anteroom hours ago with the confidence of a man executing a long-prepared plan. But plans, when they ended this way, took something out of the people who'd built them. There was a specific quality of diminishment that came not from defeat itself, but from the particular kind of defeat where you'd been outmaneuvered at the last moment by variables you'd decided weren't variables. He looked at Draven, then at Lyra, standing to Draven's right. "The scribe's finished," Draven said. It wasn't a question. Cassell didn't confirm it. He didn't need to. It was in his face, that particular compression of expression that a man who'd spent 30 years managing his own affect still couldn't fully eliminate when the thing he'd spent 30 years building had just come apart. "You had 40 riders at my south gate," Draven said. "They're being disarmed and held. Your household guard inside my keep is in custody. Your personal security from this evening is in custody." He paused. "Vane gave me your name 6 hours ago and a location for documentation that has now been witnessed by Imperial scribes and entered into the permanent record. You are done, Cassell." Cassell looked at him for a long moment. "You think this ends here," he said. His voice was still controlled. The habit of 30 years didn't disappear in one night. "The Eastern Compact is 8 houses. The succession structure I've built isn't Vane and me. It's a framework that half your noble council has signed into informally. You pull me out and you pull a thread that unravels. Things that were built on corruption don't deserve to survive the removal of the corruption," Draven said. "That's not a principle. That's just how structures work." Cassell looked at Lyra. She was a minor house daughter with a bond mark. That was all she was. "That was all she was to you," Draven said. "To me, she was the reason you had access to the throne at all. Because a king who can't find his mate is a king who's distracted, compromised, working at partial capacity. You didn't neutralize a threat. You manufactured the condition that made you necessary." He held Cassell's gaze. "I owe you nothing. The Empire owes you nothing. And the houses that followed you into this have a choice to make about which side of the Imperial record they want to be on." Cassell said nothing. There was nothing left to say that wasn't negotiation, and negotiation required leverage, and his leverage was gone. "Take him to the upper security wing," Draven said. "Full council access. He'll stand before the assembly inside a fortnight." Petra's soldiers moved. Cassell went, and the room absorbed his departure the way large formal rooms absorb departures, completely, without trace, as if the space had simply never contained him. Chet. The keep was quiet by the time the eastern sky began to gray. Not the quiet of peace, the quiet of aftermath, which was different, heavier, the silence of a building that had been through something and hadn't yet decided what it was. The soldiers were standing down in stages. The East Wing was being cleared and documented. The assembly scribes were being given food and a formal written summary of the night's events for their own record. Aldrich was in the upper security wing. Draven had not gone to him yet. He would. And that conversation would happen, and it would be the worst conversation he would have in his adult life. He knew that with the clarity of someone who'd been carrying the awareness of it since the servant passage. But it wasn't time yet. There were things that had to be done first and things that had to be felt first, and those were not the same list. He found Lyra on the north wall walk. She was standing at the railing he'd hit a man into 3 hours earlier, looking out at the eastern horizon where the light was just beginning to separate from the dark. She'd found a coat somewhere. One of the household staff had provided it, thick wool, slightly too large, and she was wearing it with her arms crossed against the cold and the silver mark on her wrist just visible below the cuff. He stopped beside her and looked at the same horizon. The wound on his shoulder had been cleaned and bound by the keep physician, tight and efficient, and it pulled when he settled against the railing, but the pain had diminished from sharp to dull, the body beginning the slow work of repair. He was tired in a way that had no quick solution, the kind of exhaustion that went all the way down, through the muscle and into something below muscle that didn't have an anatomical name. They stood in silence for a while. Below and around them, the keep moved in the rhythms of early morning. The kitchen fire starting, the first light watch changing, the ordinary machinery of 23,000 people's lives resuming around the damage of the night without waiting for permission. The dungeons, Lyra said. I know. Not just mine. Level 7 had other cells. Most were empty when I was there, but they hadn't always been. She kept her eyes on the horizon. I heard things in the first year. Before whoever was in them was moved or... She stopped. Someone needs to audit what happened in those levels, not just in my case. It'll be the first formal investigation, he said, before the assembly proceedings, before anything else. She nodded once. He looked at her profile in the early light, the line of her jaw, the set of her shoulders, the particular quality of stillness that wasn't peace but was something adjacent to it, something that had been earned rather than inherited. She had a face that had been through things and knew it and wasn't performing otherwise. That was rarer than it should have been. I need to tell you something, he said. All right. When I signed the detention order, he kept his voice even. Not because he didn't feel it, he felt it with a specificity that had been building since the dungeon cell, that had been growing through every hour of the night into something that he was going to have to carry for a very long time. I didn't know you. I didn't know the case was fabricated. I didn't know Aldrich had reviewed the evidence with Castle's fingerprints on it. He paused. None of that is an excuse. I'm not offering it as one. I'm telling you because I need you to understand the complete truth of what happened, and the complete truth includes the fact that I signed your name onto 5 years of that cell. Lyra was quiet for a moment. The horizon was lightening, the dark gray separating into the particular blue that came just before dawn when the sky remembered it had colors. I know, she said. I'm sorry. She turned and looked at him then, directly, the dark eyes clear and steady, the same look she'd given him through the opening in her cell door when she'd first seen his face and been deciding what kind of man she was looking at. I know that too, she said. It wasn't absolution. He didn't ask for it to be. Absolution was something other people granted, and he hadn't earned it yet, and might not in whatever time came next. What she was offering was something different, the acknowledgement of truth without the erasure of damage, which was harder and more real than forgiveness performed on schedule. He accepted it. The assembly will want formal proceedings, he said. Your testimony, the documentation, the witness records from the scribes, it'll be public. Your name, your case, everything that happened will be in front of every noble house in the empire within a month. Good, she said. It won't be comfortable. I spent 5 years in a cell. My bar for uncomfortable has adjusted. Something shifted in his chest, not the bond pull, or not only that, but something that the bond had been the container for all this time without his understanding what it was actually holding. He'd thought, in the abstract theorizing of a man searching for something he couldn't find, that the mate bond was about want, about the drive toward a person, the biological insistence of it, the nights it had woken him out of a dead sleep with her scent on the edge of his breath and nothing in his arms. He understood, standing on the wall walk in the early morning with this specific woman at his side, that the bond had never been about want. Want was the surface of it. Underneath was something harder and quieter and more structural, the recognition of an equal, someone who could stand in the ruins of a single night that had taken apart everything he'd built and look at the horizon and ask the right question first, not about herself, about the other cells. What do you want? He said. Not rhetorically, practically, plainly, the way you asked someone who had spent 5 years being denied the right to want anything. From here, from whatever comes next, what do you actually want? Lyra looked at the horizon for a long moment. I want the dungeons emptied and repurposed, she said. I want the audit completed and the results made public regardless of what they find. I want to understand the legal framework that made what happened to me possible, and I want to be in the room when it's revised. She paused. I want my name on the official record as cleared. Not just cleared, vindicated. The specific documentation, with Castle's role and Vane's role named explicitly, entered into the Imperial Archive. Done, he said. All of it. And I want to know, she said, quieter now, the hardness of the list softening into something more careful. What this? She gestured slightly between them, the small motion encompassing 5 years and 1 night, and a bond that had pulled at them both through stone and distance and deliberate obstruction. What this actually looks like. Between 2 real people who don't know each other yet. He looked at her. Slowly, he said. Honestly. Badly sometimes. Probably. Probably, she agreed. I'm not an easy person. I've had 5 years to develop a reasonable portrait of you from sound evidence, she said. I didn't expect easy. Something in him that had been clenched for a very long time, through the night, through 5 years before the night, through the particular kind of loneliness that came from searching for something you couldn't find and ruling an empire in the meantime. Something let go. Not all at once. Not with drama. Just the small structural release of a tension that has been present so long you'd stopped registering it as tension. The sun broke the horizon. Not gradually. The way the sun actually came up. The real sun. Not the one in stories, which was sudden and almost aggressive. The light arriving all at once and changing everything it touched from dark gray to specific color. The keep below them went from silhouette to stone, the rooftops from shapes to surfaces, the courtyard from void to the particular worn limestone that Draven had walked across 10,000 times and never looked at as carefully as he was looking at it now. Everything illuminated by the same light, everything seen as it actually was. He thought about the dungeons, which would be emptied now by his direct order, starting this morning. He thought about the cells on level 7, what they would look like with the doors open and no one inside them. Just stone rooms, lit finally by something other than a single oil lamp. He thought about what you built in a space that had held suffering, whether you could make something out of it that wasn't a monument to what happened there or a denial of it, but something third, a space that acknowledged the cost and then spent it on something worth the price. Lyra had said sanctuary. He didn't know yet exactly what that meant in practical terms. He knew it meant something, and that she would have ideas about it, and that the ideas would be worth listening to. He knew that the next year was going to be the hardest political year of his reign, and that he would fight it without Aldrich at his back, which was a loss that hadn't finished reaching him yet, that was going to arrive in full when the immediate crisis was far enough behind him that his defenses dropped. He knew that he was 31 years old, and that what he understood about power had just been revised at its foundations, and that revision felt not like destruction, but like subtraction. The removal of the false load-bearing walls that had been making the structure less stable rather than more. The clearing away that preceded real building. Lyra was looking at the light on the courtyard below. He didn't reach for her hand. That wasn't yet, and he knew it, and the knowing was all right. There was time now. The thing that had been stolen was time, and time was what he could give back. Not the 5 years. Those were permanent, unrecoverable, part of the architecture of what they both were now. But time forward. Time that belonged to no one else and wasn't being managed or manipulated or measured against a succession calendar. Just time. And what 2 people built in it when they were finally actually free to build. The assembly session, Lyra said, when you stand in front of them and make the statement, the public admission. Yes. I want to be there, she said. Not behind you, not presented. There. She looked at him directly. Standing where they can see that I'm not a victim waiting for a king to speak on her behalf. I'll speak for myself. I know, he said. I'd expect nothing else. She held his gaze for a moment. Then she turned back to the light. Below, the keep was waking up fully now. The sounds of morning, of life resuming its ordinary rhythms around the extraordinary night that had passed through it. Somewhere in the east wing, scribes were reviewing documentation. In the upper security wing, 2 men were sitting with what they'd done. At the south gate, 40 riders were being processed by Petra's watch. And on the north wall walk, in the first clean light of a morning that neither of them had been certain they'd reach, 2 people stood side by side and looked at the empire below them and breathed. That was all. Just breathed. The dungeons were going to come down. Not today. There was too much else before today was done. But soon, when the rubble of the night had been cleared, and the proceedings were in motion, and the structural work of rebuilding could begin, they would come down. The stone would be repurposed. The level 7 cells would become something that let in light. And Lyra Ashvale, who had survived 5 years in the dark by learning everything she could about the world above her, would not be thanked for her survival. She would not be celebrated for her endurance. She would be seen, clearly, fully, in the specific complexity of who she actually was, and given the room to build something out of the wreckage that was entirely her own. That was not the ending of a story. It was the beginning of a different kind of accounting, the slow, unglamorous, necessary work of two people and one empire learning what they were when stripped of everything that had been holding them in the wrong shape. The light came over the wall and touched them both. Neither of them moved. That was enough.